In December 1945, 5 torpedo bombers on a routine patrol over the Bahamas vanished without trace. It was an incident that would kickstart the notoriety surrounding the infamous Bermuda Triangle, and even now, more than 70 years later, we are still questioning what caused the mysterious disappearance of Flight 19. At the western extremity of the Atlantic Ocean, flanked on 3 sides by the islands of Puerto Rico, Bermuda, and mainland Florida, there is a vast expanse of open water, which has allegedly provided the setting for many strange occurrences. The area, known as the Bermuda Triangle, spans 500,000 square miles and is home to some of the world's busiest ports and shipping lanes. But during the latter half of the 20th century, the triangle gained notoriety as it was increasingly reported that many ships and planes entering the region were mysteriously disappearing without a trace, never to be seen again. Despite numerous investigations and an apparent rise in the number of reported cases within the last 50 years, it seems very few people have been able to provide a clear and definitive answer regarding these vanishings. Perhaps the most well-known disappearance, a case which single-handedly kick-started more than half a century of foreboding surrounding the area, is that of Flight 19, a group of 5 torpedo bombers on a routine patrol flying out of Fort Lauderdale in Florida. It is a tale that has been told countless times before, in many different incarnations, and unfortunately, like so many mysteries, it has not escaped the hand of embellishment. The sequence of events has become somewhat distorted over time, muddied by inaccuracies and omissions, to the point where it is no longer obvious which version is the truth. Our aim here is to retell it as it was officially reported, dispel any myths, and hopefully give a plausible explanation as to what happened. Although we know in our heart of hearts that this is a mystery which will probably never be solved. Wednesday the 5th of December 1945 started out sunny and bright, a typical Florida morning for the ground staff of Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale, and one which promised excellent flying conditions. A series of bombing exercises were scheduled for that day to train new crews of student aviators, and command of one of these crews was given to 28-year-old Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor. Taylor was an experienced pilot who had served 2 tours of duty in the Pacific Theatre during World War II. He had accumulated more than 2,000 hours of flying time and had become a training instructor towards the end of the war. Aside from 4 other veteran pilots, most of the airmen were inexperienced flyers, with an average of just 20 to 30 hours flying time apiece, so Taylor certainly had his work cut out. Nevertheless, he was confident they would get the hang of things quickly, and by that afternoon, they were ready to embark on their training exercise. Flight 19 took off at 2:10 p.m, comprised of 5 TBM Grumman Avengers, and made east for Hens and Chicken Shoals in the Bahamas. Their mission was to carry out a mock bombing run at a pre-designated area, then continue 90 degrees for 73 miles, before turning 346 degrees north to head in that direction for another 73 miles. Finally, they would turn 241 degrees southwest for 120 miles, which would take them back to Fort Lauderdale, a total flight time of around 2 to 3 hours. As the exercise progressed, things appeared to be going smoothly. The squadron arrived at the bombing area and dropped their torpedoes in short order without any issues. But by 3:40 p.m, the first signs that something was amiss began to manifest. Several of the crewmen expressed feelings of discomfort and disorientation, and as they made their final turn back towards base, they noticed that hardly anything looked familiar. At the same time, back at Fort Lauderdale, another torpedo squadron was airborne and getting ready to head for the bombing range, when their commander, Lieutenant Robert Cox, picked up an unnerving distress call from Flight 19. As Cox later recounted, he overheard an airman desperately asking for a position check, but no one could give an accurate answer. Cox intercepted the transmission and asked what the problem was, and to his surprise, the pilot, identifying himself as Lieutenant Taylor, responded with an ominous communication that would forever be cemented in Bermuda Triangle lore. He stated, "Both my compasses are out, and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm over land, but it is broken. I am sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down, and I don't know how to get back to Fort Lauderdale." Confused by this statement, Cox radioed back to base, which had also been tracking the radio transmissions, and requested assistance for the beleaguered flight. Then he advised Taylor to put the sun on his port wing and fly north up the coast of Florida. Meanwhile, ground crew at Port Everglades also monitored transmissions and offered their assistance. Although it was a clear day, Taylor appeared unable to find the sun, but insisted the flight would turn northeast in order to avoid flying over the Gulf of Mexico. To complicate things further, none of the in-flight navigators could accurately place their position either. Taylor was asked to switch radio frequencies because his signal was fading out, but for inexplicable reasons, he insisted on maintaining his current channel, then changed course once more in the hopes of finding a recognizable landmark. By this time, numerous ground bases had been alerted to the squadron's apparent distress, but they could do little more than monitor radio transmissions and offer course corrections, most of which went unacknowledged as Taylor's frequency faltered. To make matters worse, by 4:30 p.m, the weather began to deteriorate, which meant the crew risked having to navigate in poor conditions. No mean feat for experienced navigators, let alone raw recruits, especially during that era. At 5:15 p.m, Taylor reported that the flight was going to turn west in order to reach what he assumed would be Florida, but by then, Port Everglades had advised their fuel reserves would not hold out for much longer. This situation was confirmed when 5 minutes later, Taylor made what would be his last communication to Fort Lauderdale. "We'll continue to fly 270 degrees west until we hit landfall or run out of gas." Ground-based communications could no longer contact the flight, but could still monitor the crewmen conversing amongst themselves for over an hour. By 6:20 p.m, they heard what would be Taylor's last order to his men. "We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the last plane drops below 10 gallons, we will all go down together." And with that, all communication with Flight 19 ended forever. As the chilling reality struck ground staff a short time later, the full scale of the tragedy was yet to be realised. Even before the flight was registered lost, aircraft and crews from naval bases all over Florida took to the air to search for the missing planes. As the light began to fade, 2 PBM Martin Mariner aircraft were diverted from their own training flights to assist in the search. At 7 p.m, they split off to cover wider ground, but about half an hour later, one of the Mariners reported a radio check, and then almost immediately, it too went silent. Naval authorities now had to search for a sixth plane, and for the next 5 days, hundreds of aircraft scoured the entire area for any sign of what had happened. By the time the search was called off on the 10th of December, more than 930 sorties had been flown in search of the lost squadron and the missing Mariner plane, but nothing was ever found, and for more than 70 years, that has remained the case. Meanwhile, various news outlets had gotten wind of the tragedy, and authorities were flooded with questions which they had no hope of answering at that time. Navy placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of Lieutenant Taylor, saying that pilot error had led to a miscalculation in navigation and ultimately doomed the flight to a watery grave. Many refused to accept this, however, pointing out that Taylor and at least 4 of his crew were highly experienced pilots. They questioned how they could have lost their way so easily, especially on a bright clear day. Why had Taylor largely ignored the advice given to him by ground crew? Why had his navigational instruments failed so readily? And why had he not subsequently relied on the readings of his wingmen? Inevitably, in the years following the incident, many embellishments were added to the story. There were reports of Taylor and his crew expressing that the sea didn't look as it should and that everything appeared strange. There was also a famous line about them entering white water and even being chased by UFOs. The Navy denied that any of these transmissions ever took place, but strange events during that same era do seem to correspond with the notion of something untoward befalling the flight. There are various reports to suggest that planes were coming into contact with UFOs throughout the 1940s. During the Allied bombing campaign of 1943, Allied and German air crews allegedly reported seeing strange, glowing craft hovering beside their planes and flying in erratic patterns. 2 years after the Flight 19 case in 1947, American pilot Kenneth Arnold dramatically declared he had encountered a flying saucer in Nevada during a training exercise. Later that year, an unidentified craft supposedly crash-landed near Roswell Air Base in New Mexico. Although there is a broad range of theories regarding why disappearances occur in and around the Triangle, UFOs have always been high on the list of suspects, and it didn't take long for people to associate them with the disappearance of Flight 19. Could UFOs or some other strange phenomenon have been responsible for the squadron's vanishing? It is unlikely. None of the reported transmissions mentioned anything about unidentified flying objects or of strange phenomena occurring, but many staunch fringe theorists maintain that the original transmissions had been tampered with to remove any mention of alien craft. They claim that the supposed embellishments are in fact the real communications, and that those reported officially are pure fabrication in order to cover up the truth. Whatever the case, we may never know for sure, but it has to be said, the official explanation seems far more grounded in reality. Skeptics have rationalized the actions of Taylor and his men and presented a theory of what they believe happened, proposing that there really isn't a mystery at all. Many claim that the navigators were too young and inexperienced to properly guide the planes back home, and that others often overlook the fact that the exercise employed a strategic navigational technique called dead reckoning. Dead reckoning is a method whereby a navigator uses the sun's position and the local time to establish their current position, and then calculates the position they will be in half an hour's time. In 1945, this technique was far from perfect, and for a rookie navigator, one can only guess how difficult it would have been. The squadron was also hampered by the fact that none of the planes had timekeeping devices installed, and whilst most of the men had their own watches, none of them could find the sun during the latter half of the exercise. Even though the day had started out bright and clear, the weather deteriorated later on, and with darkness closing in, attempts to locate a recognizable landmark would have been next to impossible. Another issue that troubles some researchers is that Taylor reported both of his compasses failing without warning, as well as those of his crew. It has been suggested that the Bermuda Triangle possesses certain magnetic qualities which are known to interfere with compass readings, and that ships and planes have fallen victim to the triangle due to this interference. However, there is no evidence to support this, and what many people fail to realize is that compasses are not infallible. They will invariably give different readings over larger areas, especially one as large as the Bermuda Triangle. Personnel at Fort Lauderdale and Port Everglades triangulated Flight 19's last known position to approximately 80 miles off the coast of Florida, due east of Palm Bay. It is believed that after the squadron had finished the first leg of its mission, instead of turning 346 degrees north-northwest, they had in fact turned 45 degrees to the northeast, which took them over Great Abaco Island instead of Grand Bahama. From the air, Great Abaco Island would have looked very much like Grand Bahama, and none of the crew would have been wise to their mistake, especially if they believed their compasses were malfunctioning. After they had turned 241 degrees to the southwest, thinking they were now heading back to Fort Lauderdale, they would have instead flown over the outlying Abaco Islands in the north, known as the Fish and Pensacola Cays, and this is where the confusion began. The Cays are a long outstretched chain of islands, much like the Florida Keys, and from the air, they look very similar. Taylor mentioned specifically in his communication that he thought he was over the Keys, and at that point, must have believed his compass was so far out of sync that the flight had actually turned southwest after the bombing exercise, towards the Gulf of Mexico. How he accounted for the fact that they had arrived over the Keys in half the time it should have taken them is anyone's guess, but perhaps he assumed they had picked up a tailwind. If Taylor did believe he was over the Keys, then this would explain why he briefly turned due west before heading northeast. He was hoping to hit mainland Florida, but in reality was flying further out into the Atlantic Ocean. This is supported by the fact that Cox had begun to fly south in the hopes of locating the lost squadron, but found his communication with Taylor was deteriorating. This suggests that Flight 19 was flying in the opposite direction to him and was nowhere near the Keys. With Flight 19 now over open water, they made a number of course changes in the hopes of finding the mainland, but ultimately ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the ocean. Several transmissions were heard in which frustrated junior aviators tried to get Taylor to head west, believing they were heading in the wrong direction to begin with, but he insisted they continue on their course. Many have questioned why they didn't simply change course themselves, but the crew had started to panic, and in their desperation had probably turned to Taylor, the most seasoned and experienced pilot, to lead them back to land. This, coupled with their training and discipline, probably prevented them from going against his orders. One of the biggest questions of all is why no trace of the doomed flight was ever found. A 5-day search in all directions should have turned up at least something: rubber life rafts or the crew floating helplessly in the water. But there are those who suggest that once the planes had ditched in the ocean, the men had likely perished on impact. The Avenger did not have the best record for landing on water. Perhaps the crews had escaped their planes, but fell victim to sharks, injury, or even fatigue, and sank beneath the waves. As mentioned previously, the triangle is said to encompass almost 500,000 square miles of open water, and even for a case such as this, the chances of finding survivors, whilst not impossible, must have looked bleak at best. However, debris was found in the area the Mariner aircraft was last reported, but was never confirmed to be part of that plane. It sank below the waves before it could be examined. It is worth mentioning that the PBM Martin Mariners were prone to fuel leaks, and a random spark could ignite the aircraft mid-flight. As a matter of fact, the crew of the tanker SS Gaines Mills reported an explosion in mid-air at exactly the same time the plane fell off the radar, and in exactly the same area it was last reported. This seems rather conclusive, and although the cause of the aircraft's disappearance was not related to that of Flight 19's, it was nevertheless a tragic coincidence that they both vanished on the same day and in the same expanse of water. Whilst we can only surmise the true cause of these disappearances, whether an unfortunate sequence of events or something more sinister and unexplained, it seems that the mystery surrounding this case and that of the triangle itself are inextricably linked. As one gains in notoriety, so too does the other. Many believe that finding the missing squadron will somehow yield the key to solving and thus understanding why the triangle has become such an enigma, and we will undoubtedly return to this part of the world in a later episode. The TBM Avenger was responsible for sinking both Yamato-class battleships of the Imperial Japanese Navy during the Pacific War. An amazing achievement in itself, but one which is unfortunately overshadowed by the infamy of this tragic incident. We must also take a moment to remember each of these men, young, confident American boys, who boldly took off from the tarmac at Fort Lauderdale and flew out into that vast shimmering horizon, seeking only to serve their country and honour their family name. They could never have known their fate, but perhaps one day we will.